The War Within's beta's meta is what we are looking at for today. No, we're not going for some personal headcanon tier list of what is gonna be OP in the next expansion, like, hey guys, here's my source, trust me, these are the OP specs. We are actually going to do it literally. We have gone in the beta and checked well over 100 different top-level Mythic Plus keys being completed in the beta. So right now we're talking about, 15, 14s, and then down to 13s and 12s, the higher level of Mythic Plus keys being completed in the beta, and then checked the results. Particularly checked the popularity of the specs, which specs are being played in those keys. Because sure, the popularity of a spec doesn't always mean it's OP. Very often, regardless of if we are in retail, regardless of how a spec is doing, for example, you're bound to have Beast Mastery very popular, you're bound to have Ret very popular. If we move over to healers, guess what we're gonna find? We're gonna find very likely Holy Priest being amongst the more popular healers because it tends to be a popular spec, right? So, being popular might not always mean the spec is very strong. But since we are in the beta, players are getting hyped at, choosing the spec to play for the next expansion, trying out the specs that look strong for the next expansion. Maybe you do get some extra, insights on what players, especially perhaps, very good players that are testing high-level Mythic Plus keys, what do they have in mind for playing in the next expansion in Mythic Plus when it comes to the choice of their specs. So we start from the first category, which is the healers, looking at how many healers were being chosen in this 100 or so Mythic Plus keys. And the result is quite telling. The winners are Resto Shaman, Holy Paladin in first. It's quite clear, right? They both share 2/3 of all of the picks of healers, with then a decent representation of Restoration Druids, a small representation of both Preservation and Holy Priest, and then far lower down you have Mistweaver and Discipline. These were the choices seen in many/most of these Mythic Plus keys. No surprise, of course, that after lots of crying of being ultra nerfed and becoming weaker and weaker, of course, Holy Paladin is still being played very often, even complaining about one of their actual weaknesses, which is the absolutely terrible damage a Holy Paladin is doing in Mythic Plus keys, compared to, for example, something like a Preservation Evoker. That is also practically a non-factor right now. The value of your DPS as a healer in Mythic Plus, clearly, not many people care. Restoration Shaman does have easily more damage than a Holy Paladin in Mythic Plus, but we're not talking about much. We're not talking about the same gap as a couple of the other healers in terms of damage they can do, Preservation and Restoration Druid. It's likely more about their ability to be spot healing or to be topping the group quite quickly. In the case of this Shaman, in this +14, it was the power of their Chain Heal, where every cast averages 2 million more healing, similar to a Holy Paladin, where every cast of their Eternal Flame, their Herald of the Sun single target spender, is 1.5 million healing per cast, which is quite powerful. Single target spot healing is quite valuable in Mythic Plus compared to just raid-wide mega powerful AoE healing, like for example a Preservation Evoker could be doing. These were the main choices when it came to picking your healer, but maybe it might be due to comp. We haven't gone through all the roles yet, but maybe the comp was lacking a Bloodlust, and that's why Resto Shaman was favored. Or perhaps the comp was lacking a Combatress, and that is why a Holy Paladin might have been favored, right? So, going over to tanks, these were the popular picks of tanks in Mythic Plus, and the scenario is definitely more even and spread than it is for healers, because you do have 3 tanks being played quite often. You have Protection, Warrior, and Vengeance Demon Hunter and Blood Death Knight sharing roughly a 1/4 of the pick. Then you have Guardian and Brewmaster practically sharing the last 1/4 of the picks of tank, and far lower down you had Protection Paladin, practically ignored. Basically, if there is any presence of Prot Paladin, you have to thank Zorthax, who did go and keep playing Protection Paladin. He's practically the only one trying out Protection Paladin in decent to high enough key levels. Otherwise, there would have been no sign of Prot Paladin practically anywhere. It would just have been Protection Warrior, and then Blood DK, and then another Protection Warrior, another Blood DK, another Blood DK, and a Vengeance Demon Hunter. That's kind of the trio being split in terms of choices of tanks. Now, we're not very surprised about Vengeance. Vengeance is quite the popular pick if you already consider the current meta in Dragonflight. Plus, it might also be interesting because it has been one of the more buffed recently tanks, in particular Felskard, the hero talent that now more of the tanks we're testing out in Mythic Plus. Blood DK also, we can't say is that much of a surprise. Blood DK is traditionally quite the favored tank for many tanks. Every start of an expansion, there is always a surge of Blood DK, even if it ends up not being meta and all of the tanks are going to be re-rolling somewhere else. At the beginning, there's often a lot of hope for Blood DK. The more surprising one we could say, of course, is Protection Warrior. Dorky being quite a fan of Protection Warrior in these Mythic Plus keys, playing it very often. And we have touched on this, Prot Warrior being massively improved compared to their state in Dragonflight, and clearly, if we had to believe, based on the choices of tanks in the beta, there are quite a few tanks that are believing the same about the power of Prot Warrior right now when it comes to Mythic Plus. Now, again, is where we could be talking about composition, because now it's about the time you might start talking about, okay, we need our combat res, and then we need our bloodlust, and then perhaps some synergy amongst our picks. For example, the magical damage debuff of the Vengeance Demon Hunter with 3 caster DPS, for example. That is where you might start to see some choices, and that's where you get into the DPS category. Now, unfortunately, the DPS category should be the juiciest one, the one with the more interesting choices. Unfortunately, it ends up being possibly the more disappointing one, because when it comes to melee DPS, this is the current landscape of choices in Mythic Plus in the beta. Yes, if you see one melee DPS in a key, you have an almost a 48% chance of that melee DPS being a Frost Death Knight. That was the by far most likely scenario when looking at the compositions and the choices of the DPS. Frost DK, almost exclusively Deathbringer, Frost Death Knight, being the practically major only option when it comes to melee. We have seen with the number here 18 the surge of Assassination Rogue. We had an entire video dedicated to it yesterday. It might be continuing to rise as more and more players get into the power of the spec, but that is something somewhat recent after the last buffs they have received as well, as opposed to Frost DK, which has been more of a staple of a choice when it comes to melee DPS in Mythic Plus. So it's really hard to be talking about any other specs, like, how is Havoc doing, or how is Unholy DK doing, when you had such few entries of any of these specs, including some specs completely missing altogether, like Arms Warrior, for example, not even being there, as well as Sub Rogue and Outlaw Rogue, practically non-existent. Any rogue that was playing Assassination. So those were the picks when it comes to melee DPS, not very exciting, quite the repetitive options, let's just put it that way. However, if the melee DPS was depressing, if we move to the range DPS, we might all require psychiatric help, because the landscape of the choices for now in the range DPS camp in Mythic Plus in the beta looks like this. Now, I don't know if you're aware, but these 3 colors in green are oddly and dangerously similar to the 3 colors we have seen for 2 seasons in a row. And the colors are of Shadow Priest, of Mage, and of Augmentation Evoker. But in particular, the landslide victory of Augmentation Evoker in terms of picks. Shadow Priest and Arcane Mage in particular were somewhat, alternating here and there between picks. Sometimes it was only one of them with Og, other times it was both of them with Og, or maybe just the other. But what was the almost ever-present pick was the Augmentation Evoker. We can spend some times in here for some extra mentions. For example, Affliction Warlock did have some picks. You also had Elemental Shaman being picked quite a bit. You had also Frost Mage, so not just, you know, entirely the picks of Arcane, but also some Frost Mages being chosen. But by and large, this comp right here was again the more played. This time around, instead, you simply add the extra intrusion when it comes to the melee options of Frost Death Knight, making it in the compositions, sometimes in place of Arcane, sometimes in place of Shadow. But the one constant in the majority of the Mythic Plus keys was the Augmentation Evoker. Now, we might be still in full copium right now, maybe because these key levels are quite difficult, especially when you're still capped in item level. Maybe it's going for comfort about the current meta options, so more players are used to play with augmentation, so they just default to playing with an AUG. However, these numbers might be somewhat worrying, given the danger that this might create. Of course, this is a danger because augmentation is one of a kind, right? You have 3 DPS spots where you can choose amongst 26 something specs, but if one of them is the support, if one of them is augmentation, then suddenly you're only left with 2 DPS spots. So suddenly you have far fewer chances for any of the other DPS specs to make it in if one of them is constantly going to be your Augmentation Evoker. And that is what, unfortunately, we are seeing for now as well in Mythic Plus. You have the default option of Evoker. Your other option is going to be one of the 3, Arcane, Shadow Priest, and Frost Decay. And then the third one might be a bit more of a jolly, some extra pick, but sometimes not even then. You just keep getting the popular specs anyways. So this is the full list of the findings we have after looking at 110, I believe, different Mythic Plus keys at high enough level. It might be taken in different ways, you know, maybe the fact that, for example, there was practically 2 only Balanced Druids being played, that Balanced Druid might be super weak. Or maybe that it's doing fine, but not enough players care about Balanced Druid. Same could be said about Destro Warlock. People have just abandoned it because it was nerfed, and now nobody is giving attention to this post-nerfed Destro Warlock, which might become super powerful, or same could be said about Fire Mage, for example, because of how strong Arcane is. But right now, these were the choices, at the very least, of Mythic Plus spec options in the past few days, less than the past week of logs when it comes to Mythic Plus being run in the beta of the War Within. As I said, for now, this is just the popularity of the options. It might mean something, maybe. It might not mean anything, maybe. It might be changed by further balance tuning from Blizzard, or maybe it means exactly what it shows. It means that the meta of Mythic Plus will be Augmentation Evoker and 2 casters, and eventually Frost Decay will not hold up because they don't do enough magical damage to synergize with Vengeance Demon Hunter tank and the Arcane Intellect of a mage, and that might be the reason why. So that was what we have looked at for today, the results in the high-ish level of Mythic Plus keys in the past few days in the beta of the War Within. So make of this what you will, of these results, as we get closer and closer to the release of the expansion, but this is what the players are choosing to play in the beta, at the very least for now. So, with this out of the way, we can now leave each other on this Thursday. Thanks, of course, as usual, guys, for watching the video, as well as for supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. And when all of this is said and done, we are now leaving each other. Thank you guys for watching. See you guys tomorrow. And in the meantime, okay, fine. Finally, we got supposedly 3 days of clouds. I'll take this. I'll take this.